Today, I talk with Phillip Dunn, Chief Information Officer from Broward County Schools in Florida. We talk about what it's like working in some of the largest school districts in the United States. What are some of the benefits and drawbacks of this, and what are some of his plans that he sees on the horizon? Welcome to Focus on K-12, EdTech and the Education Experience. I'm your host, Doug Konopelko, Education Strategist at CDWG. So let's dive in as we focus on K-12.
My name is Phillip Dunn. I'm Chief Information Officer at Broward County Public Schools currently. My background in education is pretty varied. I've done time as a teacher for 2 years in my old South Bronx neighborhood where I originally hail from. I've worked as Director of Strategic Analysis for New York City Public Schools, nation's largest public school provider, where I basically ran the data reporting for all of their HR systems in an organization with more than 80,000 employees and 1.1 million school children. I've worked in suburban urban systems and been the Chief Information Officer of Stanford, Connecticut school system. I've done suburban systems and been the Chief Information Officer of Greenwich, Connecticut school system. And here I am in Broward. And I'm probably leaving out like 5 other things I've done in education on the private side. But yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like a pretty wide background there, but I think the two that probably stand out for most people is the roles in 2 of the largest school districts in the country. And when you think about just, the scale, like you said, is just almost hard to fathom. So what are some of the benefits of having these such large institutions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think with large institutions, you have a system to lean on. So there's definitely more time in large institutions to kind of ideate and think about what innovation looks like, A, and then B, you get to specialize on super specific problems where you probably don't have the opportunity just in terms of managing the day-to-day in smaller school districts. So here in Broward, for example, we're a member of IMS Global. Myself and my colleagues sit and we think about, what does the future of educational records look like, or an ambient educational record look like in the blockchain, which is something I wouldn't have the time to do in a far smaller system because I don't have as much of a system of supports to lean on.
So now that you've seen what you can do at scale, do you think there's a whole new model or some new pieces missing that we should be looking toward?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic's taught us a lot, right? And we had kind of lived life prior to the pandemic, and we had certain things we felt really good about, certain problems we knew existed within education. And then the pandemic, I like to say, wasn't the cause for a lot of the educational change that I think is going to happen, but it was the catalyst. And one of the things it's catalyzing in my mind is, this kind of bigger idea of what does it look like for public education institutions to, instead of being providers, think even bigger as platforms. In the pandemic, we've seen across the nation, parents having to manage homeschooling. We've seen organically the growth of pods. We've seen charters throw their hat into the arena and try to become attractive alternatives for families to have a physical return to schooling. We've seen districts literally spin up hybrid educational models overnight. I mean, when I was in a suburban school district, I've taken 6 months to plan out a digital learning initiative. Here in Broward, we rolled one out at scale within less than 6 weeks. So what I'm realizing is that public education can kind of start redefining its mission to think broadly across the whole marketplace for all the people that provide services to kids and say, how do we empower that? How do we empower learning on any front? And how do we even empower it when we're not the provider? Like if our kids that we would normally serve in our district are now in a pod, or they're in a home learning setting and homeschooling, or like many of our students in Broward, they, in response to a pandemic being the catalyst, go abroad to be in a country of origin for their family. And now we're trying to support the learning happening both abroad and learning that we're delivering. So there's really like this full spectrum idea, and it's forced us to think of ourselves as a platform.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and probably one thing that people don't think of when they think of how learning has shifted during the pandemic is those examples of families going abroad, right? And for you on the IT side, you start seeing network traffic coming in from Germany, and you say, hang on, what's happening in Germany? And then you get a call from a parent that says, hey, we're really having trouble accessing everything. You say, oh, okay, where are you? Well, Berlin.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a whole new paradigm.
That's happened. I mean, we found students in Germany, one of the places. We found them in China. We found them all throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. And then additionally, it's not just the variation of geography, it's the variation of time now. When we first started doing virtual learning, and it was funny because it was eerie date, it was on Friday, March 13th, we shut down here in Southern Florida. And within the first couple of weeks, we were kind of like watching the usage patterns within our learning management system, which now went from literally 30% educator adoption to 100% educator adoption in like 2 weeks, right? Broward had had a learning management system for years, and suddenly everyone was now using it. And we're watching the usage patterns of students and educators, and we started seeing this weird, huge spike around 10 p.m. at night. And as we were drilling into it, we're realizing that, wow, our kids want to learn on demand. They don't necessarily want to have a schedule dictated to them. They want us to be able to be prepared to deliver the learning services that they need whenever they feel they need it. So we'd see these spikes at 10 p.m. We see a little bit of a blip at 1 p.m. We'd see a spike in traffic at literally like 6 a.m., where we were thinking like, wow, like we have some kids that want to get up early and get a jump on the day. And again, I go back to that idea of thinking of ourselves as a platform, analogous to Amazon Web Services, or in the brick and mortar days, we're like the mall where there's many stores, and we have to create the conditions for success, even among people that are competing with us. Like AWS will let you build an app that competes with them in AWS. So that's how we really started to think of ourselves as we've kind of evolved through the pandemic.
So what would that look like for a smaller district who sees Broward then as a platform in that model?
Yeah, so what it looks like for smaller districts that look to now emerging platforms is, how do I collaborate and take advantage of some of the economies of scale that these larger platforms have, right? So for us, we've been talking to multiple youth services agencies. We've been thinking of the idea of white labeling IT services. We literally can provide bandwidth, at a far lower cost per megabyte than probably any private or public entity in this county, just given our size, and the partners that we work with. So it's that operational piece for those smaller educational providers saying, how do I work with one of these educational platforms? They're buying software at scale, likely getting, discounts on bid at up to 50% for some of these major software packages. How do other agencies that serve kids collaborate and take advantage of those resources, because we're ultimately serving the same kids? It also means a terrible amount of innovation, going back to the first question, on the curriculum side, because small districts are good, and I like to say it's like a petri dish where you get to really understand precisely what's happening, in a classroom environment, within the context of a school environment, in a classroom environment, in the context of a school environment, in the context of a district environment. You can study it under the microscope. But the innovation piece really is coming out of like the big districts that are tackling the big ideas. And I think you're going to see increasing collaborations where smaller educational providers of a number of stripes are able to now tap into some of that. And I think some of the questions are, how does that all work? How does it work for state funding streams, as money, and particularly in Florida, is increasingly following the child? How does it work for these private entities interacting with public entities? So it's an exciting future ahead of us.
Yeah, so that's kind of the big picture, right? I always like to make sure we're considering, what does this look like for our teachers, for our students? What's the impact down to that level? So what does either adopting this model, or what does the model in general sort of provide at that level?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I think it provides is options and flexibility, right? So you start with the student experience. The students, I think just there's a broader push in society to consumerize, right? Where it's no longer, the learned professional model that used to exist in the early 20th century. The doctor is the smartest man in town and he knows best, and the lawyer is the town lawyer. It's this notion of the customer has an objective, and you have to accept that, and you have to deliver on their objectives for them, right? So for students, what it's going to mean is they want access to different learning objectives that may be part of the curriculum you planned, it may not. And you have to kind of start meeting them there now. They want flexibility in those dimensions I talked about earlier. They want to travel the world potentially, for whatever the reasons, and have services. They want to wake up with a great idea at 3 a.m. and get to work and have support, and that support piece is also big too, because education is typically, right, an 8-hour a day, 9-hour a day, at most 12-hour a day provider. So how are we even shifting along that dimension of support? For the teachers, I think it's interesting in that, and I think it's harder for teachers in this kind of figuring their way out in the shift, because they're part of the service providing, but then teachers very much are people that we see as stakeholders that we're accountable to. And from a district perspective, we're always trying to service teachers and optimize for their needs, because we recognize we really can't be successful with students if we aren't successful with teachers who primarily are the ones who deliver service to the students. So for the teachers, I think they simultaneously have more of a voice, right, along this line of consumerization, but then they're also simultaneously challenged to say, how do I shift from being, I talked a little bit about that learning profession model, how do I shift from being this classroom is this thing of my design to this classroom is this thing that really like gets embedded in a student's life and supports the goals of the student's life. It kind of works around them as opposed to the student comes to class. So I'm being a little amorphous, but the broad stroke is, the students having more say in how they receive services at the end of the day, which I think is good.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's play devil's advocate for a minute then, right? I think, to your point, this is a big shift, right? This is a big idea. So what are some possible drawbacks maybe for a model that prioritizes or is built around consumerization, operational efficiency, size, and things like that?
Yeah. So the challenge with those models is always because the people that provide in those models are important, right? And what tends to happen, we look at the Web 2.0 economy as an example, is the people that provide become commodities if you're not really attentive to culture and looking at the system holistically as an ecosystem, right? I don't think either of us really can name like 3 people that work at Amazon Web Services and say what how they feel today, or it's the more you platformize and consumerize your operations, the more you kind of divorce it of those people connections, which are actually very meaningful, particularly in the educational context where like we want a kid to remember all their teachers 40 years later, right? We don't want them to just, have some memory of some random existential experience and it's not connected to people. It's not connected to meaningful, authentic, personal connections. That to me is the biggest challenge is as you focus on operational efficiency, how do you not commodify the people, which are the most important part?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're planning change, right, or when anyone's planning change, I always like to think of things as different version numbers, right? Especially we're in the technology world. We see it all the time. I still remember Windows 3.1, right? Still a fan. So I think that when it can be helpful because that's something everyone's familiar with, right? So when we're looking at something that's a major change, like what you're talking about, that might be going from 3.0 to 4.0, right? So what is maybe some of the incremental change we might need to see in between? So how do we go from 3.0 to 3.1, 3.1 to 3.2 and build up?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I think the 3.1, the next iteration is kind of coming out of the pandemic and thinking about, you know, hybrid learning models based on what we learned in the pandemic, right? So in Broward, for example, we went and we bought thousands of cameras that we put in each of the high school classrooms, or by and large, most of the high school classrooms, for the purpose of being able to broadcast voluntarily what's going on in the classroom to share with other students. That immediately became a conversation of, okay, how do we solve some of our content constraints? We have a student in a high school that wants to learn Mandarin. We have some high schools where we don't have a teacher physically present. So we're deliberately planning for, like, you know, over the 6-month horizon, 12-month horizon, how do we solve for, we can make sure that if you want to learn Mandarin in Broward, you can learn Mandarin in Broward through the technology, right? And we're going to start building the day and scheduling and where you're physically sitting as a student around that, right? It's also going to look on the 6 to 12-month horizon, kind of like the next version of some of the current gen virtual schools, where we're saying, how do we make school this place where maybe there's a core expectation of being present on premises, but then there's just drop-in optional hours for maybe 2 of the days of the week for those students that would work best for. And we do have data that suggests that there is a population of students that would work best for, just like we have data that suggests that there's students that really thrive in a traditional 100% brick and mortar experience. So I think the next version number is going to be what you see rolling out in this fall, you know, across a lot of schools in the nation, where it's this like beginnings of flexibility. Like anything you want to learn in this district that we offer, you get access to the full breadth of things we offer in this district through technology. We know that there's different learning modalities now from a programmatic standpoint on 100% brick and mortar, hybrid model, 100% virtual, you know, that's what you're going to see, I think, in the next 12 months. Then I think after that, you're going to have, probably from the learnings there, starting to think programmatically about experiences, right? And this is, we both have a tech background, right? So this is kind of analogous to software development, where software development in the early days was all about the engineering aspect of it. Then at some point they got closer to the consumer and they were like, wait, it's really the user interface. You got like the whole UI science, right? And then it even matured past there and they were like, yeah, the UI is important. It's what the customer sees, but how does the customer feel when they're using our software? Are they happy? Are they scared? So you got the whole science of user experience. I know people that literally have PhDs from major universities in just user experience. That's kind of where I see the next phase of education going, where we're optimizing around, yes, the learning outcomes are important, right? We want kids that know math. We want kids that can read, that can write well. But okay, how do they feel? The two are probably highly correlated, believe it or not. Like if you can read and write well and you can speak well, you're probably feeling good and people are making you feel good in your life and they're spending a lot of energy to do that. So I think you're going to see the focus start optimizing around that student experience. And when we design curriculum, it may become less about what are specific enumerated learning objectives in the confines of this two-dimensional page of the book. And it's more about what are the specific learning objectives in the confines of these experiences, right? To where that's going to become normal over time, where it's like, if I'm going to sit down and design curriculum, I'm going to say, the life sciences piece of the curriculum, this is going to take place today at the beach. Then there's going to be a module where we're going to the aquarium. Then and it'll become a little bit more, especially at the secondary level, I think where it'll start, is it'll be more of this kind of ambient experience that you're building the curriculum around holistically for students. Probably, you'll see this in schools maybe 2 years out. I'm sure there's some schools doing this today, but that's when we'll notice it.
Right. And probably at that really small scale where they have that flexibility, right? Where it's an individual school that works as a micro community and there's 100 students K to 12. And, they have that ability to say, tomorrow we're at the beach. So I think.
That's some word you use, which I think is so great because there's a schema for it today. This is like the community schooling model on steroids, right? It's like the natural progression. It's like there's such a wealth of learning resources just in your local community, whether it's through, vocational experiences, whether it's through work experiences, influencers within your community. And I see just as we grow in this experience powered by technology, we'll say, wait a minute, why am I sitting here when I can go and talk to someone who wrote this book down the street and we know who they are and we can manage to that.
Yeah. So your task then, Phil, is to take the community school model with the organizational efficiency at scale and just put them together. So just knock it out of the park.
Work myself out of a job. Pretty easy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Phil, I really want to thank you for being on today and sharing all this with us.
Likewise. This is always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us today on Focus on K-12 EdTech and the Education Experience. If you enjoyed today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and click the little bell so that you get notified whenever we post a new episode. Or reach out to me on Twitter @dconopelco. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time as we focus on K-12.